Happy National Fossil Day, everybody. Today is National Fossil Day, which is basically a day to celebrate within Earth Science Week all of the cool fossils that are found and how they help us in science. Now, one of the really cool things about fossils is the fact that they don't take just one form. Most people, when they think of fossils, they think of bones and skulls, like this short-faced bear over here. But we find fossils of all kinds of varieties, not only just here in South Dakota, but all over the planet. Sometimes they take the form of invertebrates, like this ammonite. Sometimes they're plants. And sometimes they're really cool because they're sometimes huge, like the mammoths we find here at the Mammoth Site. But sometimes they're really small. This is a model of a pollen grain. Now, pollen grains obviously are not going to be about this baseball-sized thing. They're going to be about the size of a speck of dust. So being able to see that all of these different fossils come in all these shapes and sizes is extremely cool because although all these fossils look different, they all are extremely important to our understanding of the fossils, but also the fossil record and what life has looked like throughout time here on this planet. Now, when a lot of people think of fossils, they think of the fossil fieldwork, which is extremely important, being able to find the fossils is what we need to do in order to study them. But we also have to make sure that they survive long term. And to do that, we have to conserve and prepare these fossils. And to help us talk a little bit about fossil prep, I brought our preparator, Tabatha, here to talk a little bit about it. So when we talk about fossil preparation, what does that mean?
So basically, fossil preparation is, in essence, obviously preparing the fossil specimens to enable the longevity of their lives. So it's going to encompass a lot of excavation, safely removing the fossils from the field, in our case the bone bed, which is nice and covered, and then what we'll do then is we'll put them in a jacket and then we'll bring them into the lab, we'll recut them open, and then we'll work on removing the matrix and stabilizing the fossils so that they can be used for exhibition for people to enjoy as well as researchers in the future.
So when you talk about removing the matrix and stuff like that, matrix is the sediment that surrounds the fossils. Why don't we just remove that in the field?
So the matrix can actually, the sediment around the fossil, depending on how it's oriented, a lot of the time that can help stabilize the fossil in transport as well as when it is sitting in storage before we can get to it to prepare. So, and actually a lot of sediment, in order to remove it, there's a lot of variation. Sometimes it can be a really soft, sandy sediment that's easy to remove, and then sometimes it can be a really hard carbonate that's like a rock. And then in order to remove those, we have a variety of different tools that we use. So like a lot of the times if it's nice and soft, we can just easily even just brush it away. And then we use, like our trusty little dental picks all the time that are super handy. But then if things get really hard, like the really hard carbonate that's cemented to the bone, we use these really fun tools that are called air scribes. So this is a pneumatic tool, and basically we attach this end to an air compressor, and then this would turn on, and then this little pointy pin works as a little, kind of almost like a little jackhammer, and then we use that on the sediment that we can remove all of the hard stuff and expose the bone surface. And then from there what we do is then we want to conserve and preserve it using consolidants. So the consolidants that we use are basically little tiny plastic beads, and we will go ahead and dissolve them in acetone. And then when we apply that to the fossil specimen, that's going to seep deep into the specimen in the pores, and then the acetone will evaporate, and then the paraloid beads will harden again and support the fossil.
So when we look at the glues and some of the chemicals we use interacting with and how they interact with fossils, what are the things we have to consider when we use those?
Yeah, well, it's kind of, a complex thing that you get a feel for over time as you're working with them. So the consolidants that we have them in different viscosities or thicknesses depending on, the fossil that we're working on and how much we need it to penetrate the fossil. So we have some viscosities that are super thin and super runny that are going to penetrate really deep, and we have super thick ones that are just like glue. So those are going to be used, if you have a big break or a crack, you're going to stick them together and hold them so that they stick together. Some of the thinner ones are going to be good for just basically seeping deep down into the pores and expanding and really consolidating it from the inside out. So, there's lots of things to consider, like, are you dealing with like a break? Is it just like some bones will be really crumbly, so are you dealing with like crumbly bones, broken bones? There's kind of a lot of like different factors to consider there. Another thing to kind of consider too are like pressure points. So if we're looking at this here, this is our giant short-faced bear that we have here at the site, and this is a cast of the giant short-faced bear. And as you can see in storage, we have it flipped upside down so that you don't have a lot of pressure going onto the teeth, which is a very delicate area and that could easily break. So that would be like taking this skull here, which is the top, and flipping it over. So then that way, you know, even if you're prepping and consolidating on it, you're going to be able to, you know, work a little bit easier with some of the more delicate areas.
So like with like all these glues and things, I'm assuming you have to write down and kind of take notes as you're prepping. Like
Yes. Yeah. So documentation with fossil prep is extremely important. You know, especially like a place like at the site. You know, they've been working on the specimens here for 30 some years. You know, so you want to be able to know what they've done in the past, especially like, you know, a jacket or a specimen can be sitting in collections for 20 years. You know, so you don't know, you know, what consolidants they used, what solvents they used, and, you know, sometimes they can all interact a little bit differently, you know. So now one of the standard practices is we want to use consolidants and glues that are reversible in case any changes happen, any mistakes happen. We want to be able to go back and, you know, be able to fix it or redo it. So that's one of the big things, always documenting, you know, like what your procedures are, what your methods are. You know, photos are very important. Always take lots of photos before and during and after, you know, and saving all of that so you have the records. And that's kind of one of the interesting things too about the bone bed is that we're working on is there's actually a preservative called Liptol that's currently on the bones now, and that was applied about 20 years ago. And at the time it was the method to use that, but only we found out over the time that it's not the best because it darkens over time and it kind of creates a shell over the specimen and doesn't really seep into the specimen to preserve it. So it sits on top, kind of like if you were to dip ice cream into like chocolate sauce and it just sits on top. So our goal now is to figure out what is the best way that we can safely remove that Liptol so that we can re-preserve the specimens underneath safely and so that they'll last. So that's kind of a fun project that we're working on currently.
Awesome.
With them.
you mentioned like talking about the bone bed and like
Yes.
you know how we have our our bone bed like indoors. Like what how does that make prepping in the bone bed unique?
I mean, it's wonderful. I mean, most field work happens outside where you're constantly dealing with the elements and it can be really hard. So the interesting thing about the bone bed is that usually if you're doing field work, you don't want to do the majority of any preparation in the field because, you're dealing with elements such as, the weather and whatnot that you can't necessarily control. And you still want some, support and matrix around the fossil, and then so you can work on it till you get to the lab. So the unique great thing with our bone bed is that it gives us the opportunity that we can actually prep in the field so that people can actually see how everything looks in situ, which means like in place. So yeah, that's a really unique, cool thing about it. Yeah.
Awesome. So in prepping here at the Mammoth Site, so you mentioned some of the projects you've been working on. Do you have any other cool, fun projects that you've been working on recently?
Sure. So right now we're actually working on a giant ground sloth, which is really amazing. So for example, this is the claw of a giant ground sloth. This is kind of how we would get it out of the ground a little bit. As you can see, it's got a lot of this sediment on the side. Like this right here is the actual claw, so it's pretty big. So this is hard carbonate that we're going to have to use to get off. So it's going to be a series of using, different consolidants and glues, as well as the trusty air scribe to remove the rest of the consolidant. And then, once that's done, that'll go back to the researchers and be housed in collections. And then if we want to use that specimen further for any kind of education purposes, a lot of times we'll make a cast or a mold. So then we could make something like this. So this was a cast of a previous ground sloth, but now we know what it looks like. We can use it for outreach events, and it's just really cool and handy to have on hand.
Awesome. So I guess kind of like wrap up the video and kind of talk a little bit about what do you enjoy about doing fossil prep? Like what kind of drew you to being a fossil preparator?
I think it's just kind of, a really magical field to get into. I think paleontology is really cool and exciting because it's almost the closest that we have to science fiction, because we get to figure out these kind of alien worlds that don't exist and that no one has seen before, So I feel like with this, we're able to reconstruct and figure out what kind of fauna existed, what did the plants look like, what were the ecosystems back then. So I think just being able to be a part of that, and helping researchers, move that further is just really exciting.
It's one of the really cool things about here at the Mammoth Site is, so we have our bones on display in our bone bed, but we also have the prep process on display, and you can actually see it when you visit the Mammoth Site. And so with that, I want to kind of wrap up this video. I want to thank Tabatha for taking some time out of her busy schedule to talk a little bit about the fossil prep process, and we'll see you guys next time.